Thank you for taking me out of rainy London into sunny Malta. So sincerely, thank you for coming to see me speak today. I'm probably going to go a little bit off script, actually, because we're running considerably behind time. And I don't know about you, but lunch is really important to me. So I'm going to really try and get us a little bit back on schedule. I am going to talk you through some work that I've done on how the world is going to look in 2050. And I picked up on one of the comments that Professor Spada used in his excellent presentation there, which was that economists have limits, particularly when they look at the long-term trends. So that's a pretty good introduction to my presentation, I think. But nevertheless, I want you to understand why I'm doing this, why I think it's really important for us to at least have a think about how the world is changing, why it's changing, and most importantly, what the implications are for us here as investors and us here as people living in the West. I think the consequences are important and we need to think about them today, because if we'd have thought in 2006 a little bit more closely about what was the potential pitfalls a couple of years down the road, I think many of you would have spotted what happened over the last couple of years. And that's what I'm trying to do today. It's looking beyond the next month and saying, if we've got something nasty down the road, what is that going to be? And for me, it's commodity markets. So I'm going to talk you through that. I'm also going to spend a minute about touching on my views, at least for what they're worth, of the European sovereign crisis, why I don't believe there is a silver bullet, and therefore why I think this is an ongoing issue that no doubt, hopefully you'll invite me back to talk about this time next year. Okay, so we've got a lot to do, and lunch is on my agenda, if not yours. So let's get moving. I'm going to pass through a lot of my slides just because I want to focus on some of the conclusions. But the purpose of my work that I've been doing over the last year within HSBC, which is under the umbrella of the world in 2050, is about understanding this chart here. The emerging markets are growing 3 times as quickly as us here in the developed world. And I wanted to understand why that's the case. And most importantly, is it sustainable? Is this kind of growth rate telling us that the emerging markets are a bubble? Is there overcapacity? Is there perhaps major inflation down the road in these emerging markets? Or can these growth rates be sustained? So that's the purpose of my report. I make no bones about the fact that it's a very difficult task, looking far in the future, but nevertheless, I still think it's one that we have to do. And the idea for me, therefore, was to go back, look at these economies in detail, and understand at what stage of development they are at. And therefore, how can they sustain these kind of growth rates? Can they continue growing at the rates that we've seen in the recent past? So let's skip through here and look at this chart. We've seen already a decade of strong growth in the emerging markets, for some of the emerging markets even longer than that. And therefore, I think a lot of people think, well, maybe they are getting to the point where that growth rate will start to slow down. And we saw that with Japan. Japan, through the 40s to the 60s, we saw this phenomenal rate of growth. And what have they done since? Not a lot. We've had 2 decades where Japan has barely managed to grow. So that makes people very nervous about these growth rates in the emerging world. But what this chart here shows you is that even though we've had a decade of very strong growth, income per person in the emerging world is still very, very low. In China, income per capita is still only 7% that of the US. In India, it's still only 2% that of the US. So there's a lot of people out there in the emerging world, and they're very cheap. But what I needed to do to understand whether they can catch up with us here in the West was to understand whether they can do what we do in the West. Are they educated? Are they healthy? Are there good government systems? Is there a good rule of law? And that was really what was driving my forecasts of how these numbers will change through time. Can the emerging markets catch up with what we're doing in the West? So for China, this is an 800% increase in income per person, 600% in India. And I know what you're all doing. You're all calculating in the back of your mind your income rising by 800% and thinking, gosh, imagine what I could do with that. And then your next thought will probably be, well, that's completely unrealistic. That's too big a number. But now if I tell you that at 2050, income per capita in China is still only 1/3 of the US. And I think that just gives you some perspective on the low level of development and how much further these guys can grow. When I add all of my projections together, this is global growth. And you can see we've been on this declining path in global growth because long-term demographic trends have been declining through time. If you look forward, we should see global growth start to accelerate from here. But it's not the developed world that's driving it any longer. It's now the emerging world that drives forward that growth, accounting for 2/3 of the growth in the global economy that we will see over the next few decades. At the moment, the emerging world is about 40% the size of the developed world, and I forecast by 2050 it will be 20% bigger. That's where the growth is, and that has important implications for how you're investing today. But as I said, it's not just about forecasting growth. For me, the reason I wanted to complete this project is because I wanted to understand the implications of this. I'm now convinced that the growth rates can continue. Now we need to think about what this means for us here in the West. And the first thing that immediately came to mind, having completed this stage of the project, was, is there enough stuff in the world for all this? Is there enough energy? Is there enough food for this change that we're seeing in the global economy? So my next stage was to project my growth numbers into energy demand. This is how much oil is left at current production. Our best guess is around 50 years, but that's current production. We know we're going to be trying to get more out of the ground at a quicker rate. So peak oil for me is a reality, and therefore we will have to face high and volatile energy prices, but most importantly, energy prices will be a constraint on how fast the global economy can run. And of course, it has major geopolitical implications as well. And you can already see this playing out today, and I believe playing out tomorrow. We have a situation where the US, we've had policymakers there throwing everything at that economy. Fiscal stimulus, QE1, QE2, another fiscal stimulus. All of this extraordinary policy action thrown at it, and now we have $125 oil prices, which has sucked all of that cash straight back out of the US economy, and now it's faltering again. So we will not be able to maintain the kind of growth rates that we've seen in the past if we don't work out a way of getting around this energy constraint. We can't go to coal because of the climate change implications. We need to use less energy. We need to start talking about renewable sources. But I've met some businesses on the island who, over the last couple of days, that I've already been fantastically impressed with about how we're overcoming this energy challenge. So I don't want to depress you all too much. I do think it's surmountable. I talk in the report, again, which I would be happy to give you a copy of, about how you can overcome this energy challenge. But if we don't, if we continue to be as complacent with energy as we are today, we are in for a very difficult time in terms of the speed of global growth and the inflation rates that we're going to be facing here in the West. So now let's go on and talk a minute about an issue that's a bit closer to home, and that's the European sovereign crisis. I don't have any charts for this, I'm afraid, but this is just something I felt I really needed to run through today. So to me, the problem with the European issue, the European sovereign issue at the moment, boils down to the fact that debt levels aren't sustainable because government expenditure is still above government receipts. And that, I think, is the foundations for thinking about how you solve this crisis. We need to get into a position where government receipts are above government expenditure. Now, the problem with increasing government receipts is that there are some extraordinary fiscal packages, fiscal austerity packages, that are underway in the periphery at the moment. And, of course, in order to try and improve their competitiveness without being able to devalue their currency, they're under pressure to reduce domestic prices. So there's this downward pressure on nominal growth in the economy, which is therefore downward pressure on government receipts. On the other side of the equation, you've got government expenditure. Now, of course, they're trying to reduce expenditure, but that's difficult when you have an economy that's faltering. The other element of government expenditure, of course, is servicing the actual debt itself. The interest payments that are on the debt and trying to repay these very large levels of debt in itself. So how can you readdress that equation? How can you try and get receipts moving back above expenditure? Well, nominal growth, but as I've said, that's pretty difficult to try and improve the prospects for that side of the equation. So what about reducing the expenditure side of the equation? Well, trying to reduce fiscal spending, but at the same time, if that leads to a recession in your economy, it could be counterproductive. So this big problem is with the interest rate and the debt servicing component of the equation. And that is why we have had the talk of restructuring over the last few weeks emerge within the policy circles. Can we actually just reduce some of the obligations on the expenditure side, perhaps reducing interest rates charged on these loans, or actually restructuring the debt in total in order to try and release some of that pressure on the government? But I don't see, again, that this is an option that's particularly a silver bullet for this problem. Because let's think about the restructuring options. There are then two. There's soft restructuring, reprofiling the debt, giving you a longer period over which to repay it. But the problem with that, of course, is that we still haven't solved that underlying issue of the numbers just look too big for you feasibly to be able to repay that volume of debt over the coming years, given the expected performance of your economy. So we've moved the goalposts a little bit, but the underlying problem is still there. The other issue for me is that if people have bought peripheral debt but then insured themselves through a CDS market, but then a restructuring, a reprofiling does not allow you to trigger that insurance, then what is the implications through the CDS market? And I think one of the important lessons from Professor Spadda's presentation was unintended consequences. You do something with the financial system, and actually you realize you've created a whole new problem that's 10 times bigger somewhere else. And for me, that is the issue with a soft restructuring of the debt. A hard restructuring, well, again, it comes back to the fact that we still don't understand the financial system. It's still too complex. It's still too interlinked. And controlling the contagion through the financial system, I think, is a frightening prospect. So the restructuring, I think, is fraught with problems. And that's why we're in a situation where we're having policymakers, you know, the most eminent policymakers, and economists and politicians in the region, all coming out with different ideas, because there really is no clear, quick solution for how you readdress that underlying problem, which is receipts are less than expenditure. There's nothing quick that can be done today, as far as I can see, to solve that problem. So for us in financial markets, I sit on a trading floor advising 3,000 traders every day, and the difficulty, therefore, for us is we're weighing up two different types of political risk. Within the periphery, we're weighing up austerity fatigue. At what point do the populations in the periphery find that they've had enough with these austerity packages? At what point do politics become an issue within the periphery? And at the same time, then there's also handout fatigue within the core. If you're having to continually bridge that gap with bailout package 1, 2, 3, 4, because the underlying problem of sustainability still hasn't been addressed, if you are therefore having to continually meet that difference, then you have potentially a problem of handout fatigue within the core. So unfortunately, I can't give you a clear view of exactly how this is going to end, but hopefully I've at least made clear why it's really difficult to address the underlying problem, why there is no clear, quick solution, and therefore for us it's going to be a case of monitoring very closely what happens within the political circles, both within those that are short of funds and those that are providing the funds. Our best guess, in no way are we Eurosceptics. We absolutely believe the euro will exist in 10 years' time. No question of that whatsoever. But certainly I think how this issue is resolved To us, we think it's a long process. There's nothing quick that means it will be out of the headlines anytime soon. So that was a very brief wrap-up of both the global economy in the next 4 decades and the European sovereign crisis. I'm going to be around for lunch. I'm going to be around for the next couple of hours. If there's anything you want to ask me about some more detail of the work I've been doing or any other areas that I haven't touched on, please do just come and have a chat, and I can provide you as well with the reports that I've been working on. But at that point, I'll leave you, and I hope you enjoy your lunch, particularly with the commodity challenges that we face ahead of us. So I'd pop some bread rolls in your pocket on the way out. Thank you very much.